Close your eyes for just a moment. Now imagine you're at a party. The room is full of people, talking, laughing, connected. You're standing right there among them, but somehow you feel like you're watching through glass. Everyone else seems to have figured out something you haven't. They're fluent in a language you're still struggling to speak. Now open your eyes, because that feeling, that specific ache of being surrounded yet separate, is something you probably know. Maybe not at a party, but somewhere. In your office, too, at a family gathering, scrolling through your phone at 2 in the morning, looking at everyone else's seemingly perfect lives. Here's what makes this moment remarkable. You're not alone in feeling alone. Right now, as you're listening to this, roughly 160 million people in America are experiencing some form of loneliness. That's not an exaggeration. That's 30% of all adults feeling lonely at least once every single week. 10%, 26 million people, feel it every day. Every morning, they wake up to that familiar hollow sensation. That quiet understanding that something essential is missing. And here's the part that might surprise you. This isn't a personal failing. It's a public health crisis. In May 2023, the Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Vivek Murthy, made an unprecedented declaration. Loneliness is officially an epidemic. Not metaphorically, medically. A public health threat on par with smoking and obesity. Let that settle for a moment, because loneliness isn't just an unpleasant feeling we can brush off or power through. Research shows it increases the risk of premature death by 26%, comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It elevates cardiovascular disease risk by 29%. It increases stroke risk by 32%. It accelerates cognitive decline, weakens immune function, and contributes to dementia. The Surgeon General called it, correctly, this is a crisis affecting millions, with consequences measured not just in emotional pain, but in actual mortality. Tonight, we're going to explore something that lives in the space between connection and isolation, between our deepest need and our lived reality. Something that's simultaneously ancient and urgent, biological and social, invisible yet devastating. This is the story of loneliness, and it's more complicated and more hopeful than you might think. Part 2. Defining loneliness. More than just being alone. Let's start with something crucial that often gets confused. Loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. Solitude is the objective state of being alone. It's physical, measurable. And for many people, solitude isn't just tolerable, it's necessary. It's the quiet Sunday morning with coffee and a book. It's the solo walk where your mind can wander freely. Loneliness, on the other hand, is entirely subjective. It's the painful gap between the social connection you desire and the connection you actually have. You can experience crushing loneliness in a crowded room. You can feel isolated despite being surrounded by family. Because loneliness isn't about physical proximity. It's about the quality and meaningfulness of connections, or the lack thereof. Researchers define loneliness as the subjective feeling of being alone, and the distress that results from discrepancies between ideal and perceived social relationships. It's the mismatch that hurts, wanting to feel truly seen and finding only surface-level interactions, craving deep conversation and getting only small talk, the awareness that the relationships you have don't match the relationships you need. There's emotional loneliness, the absence of a close emotional attachment, like a romantic partner or best friend. And social loneliness, the absence of a wider social network or community. Both matter, and people can experience either or both simultaneously. What makes loneliness particularly insidious is its subjectivity. Two people with objectively similar social lives, same number of friends, similar contact frequency, can feel completely differently. One might feel deeply connected, while the other feels painfully isolated. Recent research from Harvard found that 21% of adults feel lonely, but what emerged was more revealing. Many felt disconnected, even from people they interact with regularly. They described not feeling part of meaningful groups despite technically belonging to various social structures. Quality matters more than quantity. You can have 100 acquaintances and still be lonely. You can attend social events regularly and still feel fundamentally alone. Because loneliness is about meaningful connection, about being truly known, genuinely understood, deeply seen. Here's something fascinating. Loneliness correlates only weakly with objective measures of social isolation. When scientists measure actual social contact, these metrics explain surprisingly little of the variation in loneliness. The correlation sits at about 0.20. You can be objectively isolated, but not lonely. Conversely, you can be objectively well-connected, yet devastatingly lonely. This distinction matters enormously. If loneliness were simply about lacking social contact, the solution would be straightforward: create more social opportunities. But it's not that simple. Loneliness is about meaning, about depth, about the subjective experience of connection quality. Understanding this is foundational to everything else we'll explore tonight. Part 3. The numbers tell a story. The scale of this epidemic becomes clear when we examine the data. 30% of adults experience loneliness weekly. But let's look wider. A Gallup survey from 2024 found that approximately 20% of US adults experience daily loneliness, roughly 52 million individuals. Globally, the World Health Organization estimates about 16% of people worldwide experience loneliness. That's over 1 billion people. But loneliness doesn't distribute evenly. Young adults aged 18 to 34 report some of the highest levels. Nearly 30% feel lonely every day or several times a week. This generation, often called the most digitally connected in history, is paradoxically the loneliest. Interestingly, loneliness follows a U-shaped curve across the lifespan. It's high in adolescence and young adulthood, decreases during middle age, then rises again in late life. A Northwestern medicine study from April 2024 confirmed this pattern. The middle years, when people are embedded in work and family structures, offer some protection. Among older adults, 33% reported feeling lonely at least some of the time in 2024. That's 1 in 3 older adults, and certain groups face even higher risks. CDC data from 2022 showed loneliness prevalence was highest among bisexual and transgender persons. Multiracial adults reported 42% loneliness rates. Economic factors play a role too. Americans earning under $30,000 annually showed 29% loneliness compared to 18% for those earning over $100,000. Geographic patterns emerged as well. Metropolitan areas like Riverside, Detroit, Atlanta, and Seattle showed the highest loneliness rates. Major cities exceeded national averages. This seems paradoxical. Dense urban areas should offer more social opportunities. But as we discussed, loneliness isn't about proximity. A 2021 study found that population density actually correlates with higher loneliness levels. The pandemic effect remains significant. 25% of Americans felt lonelier than before COVID-19 as of January 2024. The disruption to normal social development during crucial young adult years appears to have had lasting effects. But here's what's perhaps most concerning. 81% of adults who reported loneliness also reported anxiety or depression, compared to only 29% of those who weren't lonely. These numbers tell us this isn't a personal failing. When 30% of adults feel lonely weekly, when 52 million Americans experience it daily, we're looking at something systemic. Something about modern life is making genuine connection harder to achieve. Part 4. The evolutionary roots. Why we need each other to understand loneliness. We need to go back to its origins. Because loneliness isn't some modern malfunction. It's an ancient feature carved into our biology by millions of years of evolution. The late John Cacioppo, a neuroscientist at the University of Chicago, revolutionized our understanding with his evolutionary theory of loneliness. Cacioppo argued that loneliness is a survival signal, just like hunger, thirst, or physical pain. Think about pain. When you touch a hot stove, pain instantly signals danger. It's unpleasant, but adaptively so. That discomfort protects you. Pain is information. Pain is protection. Loneliness works the same way, but for social connection rather than physical safety. For our ancestors, being separated from the group was literally life-threatening. Humans survived through cooperation, through coordinated hunting, through shared vigilance against predators, through collective child-rearing, through accumulated cultural knowledge. In this context, social isolation meant danger. If you drifted to the edges of your tribe, your survival chances plummeted. So evolution crafted a warning system. When social bonds weakened, your brain triggered loneliness. That gnawing discomfort served a function. It motivated you to re-engage, to repair relationships, to return to safety. This is why loneliness feels so terrible. It's supposed to. The discomfort is the feature, not the bug. Cacioppo's research revealed that loneliness has genetic components. Twin studies showed about 48% of the variation in loneliness is heritable. This variation makes evolutionary sense. You need people sensitive to disconnection who'll maintain group cohesion. But you also need people who can tolerate isolation to explore new territories. Both serve the collective. The evolutionary perspective explains why loneliness triggers specific changes. When you feel lonely, your brain activates ancient survival programs. You become hypervigilant to social threats. Your stress response activates. Your reward system recalibrates, making social stimuli less rewarding while you focus on self-preservation. Your sleep becomes lighter, as though your brain remains vigilant, even at rest. All these changes what made sense for our ancestors facing genuine isolation in dangerous environments. But here's the cruel irony. In the modern world, these adaptations become maladaptive. Hypervigilance makes you interpret neutral interactions as threatening, then says. Dampened reward system means social opportunities don't feel satisfying. The very mechanisms designed to motivate reconnection instead create barriers to it. This is what Cacioppo called the loneliness trap. Loneliness triggers changes meant to motivate reconnection, but chronic loneliness means those changes persist and actively undermine your ability to connect. You become defensive, suspicious, less socially skilled. The loneliness deepens. The cycle continues. Understanding the evolutionary roots destigmatizes loneliness. You're not weak for feeling lonely. You're experiencing an ancient signal that helped keep your ancestors alive. The problem isn't that the signal exists. It's that modern life creates conditions where it fires chronically. But Cacioppo's research also found that neurological changes associated with loneliness are reversible. Animal studies showed resocialization could restore normal brain function. Human studies suggested the same. Loneliness, even chronic loneliness, isn't a permanent state. Connection is possible. Part 5. Inside the lonely brain. The neuroscience of loneliness reveals specific structures and networks that change in response to perceived social isolation. In 2016, researchers at MIT, led by Gillian Matthews and Kay Tai, made a groundbreaking discovery. They identified specific neurons in mice that represented loneliness-like states. These neurons, located in the dorsal raphe nucleus became active during social isolation. When researchers stimulated these neurons, even socially housed mice suddenly sought companionship intensely. This was the first time anyone had pinned loneliness to specific cellular substrate. It provided crucial support for the evolutionary theory. Loneliness represents a motivational state encoded in neural circuitry, designed to drive social reconnection. Human neuroimaging studies have revealed fascinating patterns. The prefrontal cortex shows altered activity in lonely individuals, suggesting changed processing of social information. The anterior cingulate cortex shows heightened activity in response to social pain. The amygdala shows heightened responses to negative social images. Lonely people are primed to detect social danger. Meanwhile, the ventral striatum shows dampened responses to positive social stimuli. Images of happy social scenes activate the reward system less robustly in lonely individuals. Social rewards literally feel less rewarding at the neural level. The evidence from resting state studies suggests lonely individuals show altered connectivity patterns in several networks. The default mode network shows disrupted connectivity. The salience network shows patterns suggesting heightened vigilance. All of these neural changes point to a consistent pattern observed across multiple studies. Loneliness correlates with brain states oriented toward threat detection and self-protection. Whether these changes cause loneliness or result from it, or both, remains an active area of investigation. The current evidence suggests bidirectional relationships. Beyond neural structure, loneliness triggers biological changes at the molecular level. Research has found elevated inflammatory markers in lonely individuals. This chronic inflammation contributes to cardiovascular disease, accelerated aging, and cognitive decline. Gene expression changes too, upregulation of pro-inflammatory genes and downregulation of genes involved in antiviral responses. Post-mortem studies showed elevated markers associated with Alzheimer's disease in individuals who reported high loneliness. Loneliness doesn't just correlate with dementia risk. It may actively contribute to neurodegenerative processes. But here's the crucial finding. These changes are not permanent. Animal studies of resocialization show remarkable neural recovery. Human intervention studies suggest similar plasticity. The brain retains capacity to heal from loneliness-induced changes. Part 6. The social media paradox. One of the most perplexing aspects of modern loneliness is the role of social media. Technologies explicitly designed to connect people may be making loneliness worse. In January 2025, Baylor University researchers published a study following nearly 7,000 Dutch adults for 9 years. The findings were sobering. Both passive social media use, scrolling without engaging, and active use, posting, commenting, messaging, were associated with increased loneliness over time. Moreover, the study found a bidirectional relationship. Social media use predicted increased loneliness, but loneliness also predicted increased social media use. A feedback loop. James Roberts, the lead researcher, described it as a continuous negative feedback loop. Why? Researchers have proposed several mechanisms that could explain this paradox, though the exact pathways are still being investigated. First, there's what researchers call the quality versus quantity issue. Social media excels at increasing interaction quantity, but not quality. Based on what we know about human connection, we can infer that a 5-second emoji reaction provides a fundamentally different psychological experience than a 2-hour conversation where someone really listens. This interpretation is supported by studies showing that quality, depth, intimacy, vulnerability predicts well-being, not quantity. Second, social comparison. When you scroll through feeds, you're exposed to carefully curated highlights of others' lives. This creates a distorted picture where everyone else seems happier and more connected. Research by Wang and colleagues in 2020 found that more time viewing others' seemingly happier lives correlated with increased loneliness, likely fueled by envy. Third, researchers have proposed the substitution effect, though the extent of this mechanism is still debated. The hypothesis suggests that time spent on social media is time not spent in face-to-face interaction. Studies examining this possibility suggest that in-person interaction may provide benefits that digital interaction cannot fully replicate. There appears to be something about physical presence that digital mediation doesn't capture. Fourth, asynchronous communication removes the rhythmic back and forth of genuine conversation. You send something and wait. The uncertainty this creates can feel isolating. A 2024 study using Health Information National Trends Survey data found social media's relationship to loneliness varied by generation. For baby boomers and the silent generation, daily social media use was associated with significantly higher loneliness scores. This suggests that for older adults, social media might be a particularly poor substitute for traditional connection. Yet surveys found that 73% of Americans believe technology helps them form relationships, and 16% feel a high sense of belonging on social media. So, for some people, in some contexts, these platforms do facilitate genuine connection. The difference seems to hinge on how they're used. Using social media to arrange in-person meetups, helpful. Using it as a primary substitute for connection, harmful. An experimental study found that students who limited social media use to 10 minutes daily for 3 weeks experienced significant reductions in loneliness compared to unlimited use. The evidence increasingly suggests social media isn't inherently good or bad for loneliness. Its effect depends on how we use it. As a supplement to rich in-person lives, it can be beneficial. As a replacement for genuine intimacy, it exacerbates loneliness. Sad. Part 7. The pandemic's lasting shadow. COVID-19 created an unprecedented natural experiment in forced social isolation. The immediate effects were predictable. Loneliness spiked. In March 2021, 42% of older adults reported feeling lonely, up from 34% in 2018. Young adults were hit particularly hard. Data from the Swiss Household Panel found loneliness increased disproportionately among younger individuals. This makes developmental sense. Young adulthood is critical for forming relationships and peer networks. The pandemic interrupted these processes at a crucial juncture. But the pandemic's impact wasn't uniform. For some, it was devastating. People who derived energy from in-person interaction struggled severely. However, about 23% reported feeling less lonely post-pandemic. For introverts and those who found constant social obligations draining, the enforced slowdown was actually a relief. Dr. Stephen Rush, a psychiatrist at UC Health, described a pattern he observed. Isolation became a protective habit. The internal message became, being alone protects me from scary things I can't control. What started as rational caution appeared to transform into an ingrained pattern that persisted long after the acute danger passed. This interpretation aligns with what behavioral psychology would predict. When a behavior successfully reduces anxiety, it gets reinforced. The evidence suggests that for some people, isolation shifted from necessary precaution to learned avoidance pattern, making re-engagement more psychologically difficult, even when it became safe. This habituation may be one of the pandemic's most insidious psychological legacies. People adapted to being alone. They lost practice navigating casual social interaction. The skills atrophied slightly. The discomfort of putting yourself out there socially became more pronounced because you'd lost the muscle memory of connection. What was once natural, striking up a conversation, making plans, being physically close to others, now required conscious effort and courage. For people with already fragile social networks, the pandemic often severed them entirely. Weak tie relationships, acquaintances, casual friends, work colleagues, died from lack of maintenance. When you see someone only through structural overlap, at the gym, in the office, at a weekly event, and that structure disappears, the relationship often disappears too. Strong ties, by contrast, generally survived. Close friends and family made effort to stay connected. But weak ties, which research shows are actually quite important for well-being and social integration, evaporated en masse. This meant that when restrictions finally lifted, many people found their social networks dramatically thinned. The pandemic fundamentally changed how we think about proximity and contact. Touch became potentially dangerous. Even people who intellectually knew the danger had passed often found themselves with lingering anxiety about physical closeness. Now, in 2026, we're still processing these changes. Loneliness rates have stabilized somewhat from pandemic peaks, but remain elevated. The pandemic didn't create the loneliness epidemic. It existed before COVID-19. But the pandemic intensified it and left lingering effects that complicate recovery. Part 8. The ripple effects. Loneliness increases the risk of premature death by 26%, comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. But how does loneliness kill? Cardiovascular disease stands out. Research shows lonely individuals have significantly elevated risk for heart disease and stroke. Meta-analyses found heart disease risk increases by 29% and stroke risk by 32%. Mechanisms include chronic stress elevation, persistent cortisol damage to blood vessels, and inflammatory markers contributing to atherosclerosis. Immune function suffers. The immune system recalibrates in loneliness, prioritizing inflammatory responses over antiviral defense. Lonely individuals heal more slowly, respond less effectively to vaccines, and suffer more severe symptoms from common illnesses. The connection between loneliness and dementia is particularly well established. Multiple longitudinal studies found lonely people show faster cognitive decline and higher risk for Alzheimer's. Post-mortem studies showed elevated amyloid and tau burden, Alzheimer's hallmarks, in individuals who reported high loneliness during life. Mental health consequences are severe and bidirectional. 81% of lonely adults report anxiety or depression, compared to 29% of non-lonely individuals. Loneliness increases depression risk, but depression also increases loneliness risk. They feed each other in a vicious spiral. Suicide risk increases substantially in lonely individuals. Beyond individual health, loneliness has societal costs. The Cigna Group's 2025 research found more than half of American workers feel lonely, with far-reaching business implications. Lonely employees miss more work, show higher disengagement, and are more likely to leave jobs. Community cohesion suffers. Lonely individuals participate less in civic activities, vote less often, engage less with neighborhoods. When loneliness becomes widespread, the entire social fabric weakens. Perhaps most troubling, loneliness appears to perpetuate inequality. Low-income individuals, minority groups, LGBTQ individuals, immigrants, all face elevated risk. Loneliness then exacerbates their vulnerabilities, creating another dimension of disadvantage. Part 9. The vicious cycle. One of loneliness's most frustrating aspects is how it perpetuates itself. The state of being lonely triggers changes that make escaping loneliness more difficult. Start with hypervigilance to social threat. When lonely, your brain becomes exquisitely sensitive to rejection signals. Ambiguous social cues get interpreted negatively. Someone doesn't immediately text back, they must be angry at you. A friend seems distracted during lunch, they're probably annoyed by your company. A colleague doesn't invite you to an event. Clear evidence you're not liked. Research using EEG found. Lonely individuals show faster responses to negative social cues and heightened attention to negative emotional distractors. Their brains literally process potential social threats more quickly and thoroughly. This hypervigilance makes social situations exhausting and anxiety-provoking. You're constantly scanning for danger, constantly braced for rejection, and that vigilance becomes self-fulfilling. When you expect rejection, your behavior changes in ways that invite it. You become defensive. You withdraw preemptively to avoid potential hurt. You keep people at arm's length emotionally. You respond to perceived slights with hostility or passive aggression. None of this is conscious or intentional, but it's driven by threat detection systems operating in overdrive. The dampened reward processing contributes too. Social interactions that should feel rewarding register less positively in the lonely brain. So even when opportunities arise, they don't provide expected payoff. This makes motivation for future engagement harder to muster. The self-focused orientation intensifies. Lonely people show reduced empathy and pro-social behavior. This makes sense evolutionarily. When the group isn't protecting you, you conserve resources. But in modern contexts, this self-focus pushes people away. Research documented that lonely individuals engage in behaviors that undermine relationships. Excessive reassurance seeking, testing behaviors, negative interaction patterns, poor conflict resolution. They're simultaneously desperate for connection and convinced it will go badly. Sleep disruption exacerbates everything. Chronic poor sleep impairs emotion regulation, reduces cognitive control, increases irritability. It makes social interactions harder to navigate skillfully. Social skills can atrophy from disuse. If you've been isolated long, you lose practice at conversation, reading body language, maintaining friendships. This creates barriers to re-engagement even when see them. Opportunities arise. Self-esteem damage compounds the problem. Loneliness makes you feel defective. When you believe you're unlikable, you interpret others' behavior through that lens. You engage in safety behaviors, keeping conversations superficial to avoid revealing your true defective self. But safety behaviors prevent intimacy. All these factors create a self-reinforcing system. Loneliness alters your brain and behavior in ways that make connection harder. Those difficulties increase loneliness. The cycle tightens. Cacioppo described lonely individuals as stuck in a particular state, not because they're choosing to be, but because the state itself creates barriers to escape. Breaking the cycle requires understanding these mechanisms and addressing the underlying patterns. Part 10. Finding connection. What actually works to reduce loneliness? The evidence base is extensive. A comprehensive meta-analysis from 2024 examined 280 studies across the lifespan. The findings revealed a small to moderate short-term effect. Importantly, effects held across age groups. Psychological approaches emerged as most effective. These include cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based interventions, and therapeutic programs focused on developing emotional and social skills. Why are psychological interventions particularly effective? Because they address the maladaptive thought patterns that perpetuate loneliness, the hypervigilance, negative interpretations, dampened reward processing. For example, CBT for loneliness helps someone recognize they're automatically assuming rejection in ambiguous situations. The therapist helps generate alternative explanations, test those alternatives, and gradually shift toward balanced interpretations. Social and emotional skills training showed moderate effectiveness. These programs teach specific skills for initiating conversations, maintaining friendships, resolving conflicts, and reading social cues. Social support interventions, programs providing companionship, regular contact, or organized social activities, showed small to moderate effects. These work better for people whose loneliness stems from genuine lack of social contact, rather than those whose loneliness exists despite adequate contact. Arts, music, and cultural activities consistently showed positive effects, particularly when involving group participation. Creating art together, making music in ensembles, these provide natural contexts for connection around shared interests. One crucial finding: multi-component interventions were more effective than single-approach programs. Combining psychological work, skills development, and practical opportunities worked better than any single element alone. This makes sense. Loneliness is multifaceted. Interventions incorporating purposeful activities showed particular effectiveness. When people come together around shared purpose, volunteering, community, projects, helping others, connection emerges more naturally. 75% of adults said finding ways to help others would reduce their loneliness. Community-level interventions showed promise too, creating physical spaces, encouraging connection, organizing community events, social prescribing programs where doctors refer lonely patients to community activities. Duration and intensity mattered. Very brief interventions showed weaker effects than longer programs, but overly demanding programs face dropout issues. Successful interventions find a middle ground, substantive enough to create change, manageable enough to maintain participation. The intervention research provides genuine hope. With the right approaches, loneliness can be reduced. It takes effort, time, and often professional support. But it's possible. The brain changes are reversible. New patterns can be learned. Connection can be rebuilt. Tundas. Part 11. The path forward addressing loneliness requires action at multiple levels. For individuals experiencing loneliness, evidence-based strategies include reaching out to different people regularly, considering professional support like therapy, prioritizing quality over quantity in relationships, engaging in meaningful activities, practicing reframing automatic negative thoughts, taking care of physical health, being intentional about technology use, seeking community, practicing self-compassion, and remembering that asking for help is strength, not weakness. At the community level, we need infrastructure supporting connection, physical spaces designed for interaction, programs bringing people together around shared interests, support for community organizers, intergenerational programs, and social prescribing programs treating loneliness as a health issue. At the societal level, we need structural changes, workplace policies supporting connection, urban planning prioritizing community, economic policies addressing inequality, education integrating social-emotional learning, public health campaigns raising awareness, research funding, technology platforms redesigned around genuine connection, healthcare systems screening for loneliness, and cultural shifts valuing relationships explicitly. What's crucial to recognize is that individual effort alone can't solve a problem this widespread and structural. The problem is systemic, which means solutions must be too. That doesn't absolve individuals from working on their own loneliness, but it means we shouldn't place the entire burden on isolated individuals to fix a problem partly created by how we've structured modern life. We need both. Individuals taking responsibility for their social health and communities, organizations, and societies creating conditions where connection is possible and supported. Part 12. Closing reflection. The hidden truth. So here we are. We started with a paradox. In the most connected era in history, loneliness has reached epidemic proportions. We've explored this from multiple angles: evolutionary, neurobiological, social, cultural, technological. But there's something crucial I haven't told you yet, something that recontextualizes everything we've discussed tonight. The loneliness epidemic, this crisis affecting millions, might not primarily be about more people feeling lonely. Our ancestors felt lonely too. Loneliness has always been part of the human condition. What's changed isn't necessarily the prevalence of the feeling itself. What's changed is what happens next. Think about it. When someone in a traditional village felt lonely, experienced that ancient signal we've discussed, the village had automatic responses. Community structures kicked in. Extended family lived nearby. Religious gatherings happened weekly. Work was communal. Neighbors knew each other. There were rituals, traditions, and expectations that guided people back toward connection. The signal fired. The environment responded. The cycle completed. Modern life has dismantled much of that scaffolding. We've created a world where the biological signal of loneliness still fires. It's ancient, automatic, trying to protect us. But the social infrastructure to resolve it has fractured. We live far from family. We barely know our neighbors. We work alone at home or in anonymous offices. Religious and community organization membership has declined dramatically. The rituals that once automatically brought people together are mostly gone. So the signal fires, but there's nowhere for it to go. It's like a smoke alarm going off in an empty house. The warning system works perfectly, but no one's there to respond. This means the loneliness epidemic isn't primarily about defective individuals who can't connect. It's about a functional biological system operating in a dysfunctional social environment. The problem isn't that the alarm is broken. The problem is that we've removed the fire department. This reframes everything. It means loneliness isn't evidence you've failed at being human. It's evidence you're human in a system that's failing you. Your loneliness makes sense given the context you're navigating. The signal is working exactly as designed. The environment just isn't set up to respond to it anymore. It also means solutions can't be purely individual. Yes, personal effort matters enormously, but we also need to rebuild the social infrastructure, the community spaces, the regular gatherings, the rituals, the structures that make connection less dependent on individual heroism. Our ancestors didn't need to be particularly skilled at friendship to avoid loneliness. The environment did half the work for them. Community happened automatically through shared survival needs. We've gained much through modernity, mobility, choice, freedom from oppressive traditional structures. But we've lost something too. And what we've lost is precisely what loneliness is signaling we need. The hope in understanding this is profound, because it means we can intentionally rebuild what was lost. Not by returning to the past, we can't and shouldn't, but by creating new forms of community infrastructure suited to modern life. And it means that when you feel lonely, you're not broken. You're experiencing an ancient, functional signal that's trying to help you. The challenge isn't fixing yourself. The challenge is finding or creating the structures that allow that signal to complete its work, guiding you back toward the connection you need. So yes, loneliness is an epidemic, but not because we're getting worse at being human, because we've created a world that's gotten worse at supporting our very human need for connection. And that, unlike personal failure, is something we can collectively address. If you found value in this conversation and want to support this channel's continued exploration of psychology that's both scientifically rigorous and deeply human, consider subscribing. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And remember, experiencing loneliness in a world that's lost much of its social infrastructure doesn't mean you're failing. It means the signal is working, even when the response system isn't. Rest well.